carefully, and hopefully I'll have that ready by Monday. Okay. Okay. The passing score, by the way, for any exam or quiz, lecture or lab is 60%. Okay. So I'll be grading over the weekend your exams. Each lab exam is worth 10% of the course grade. Therefore, because we have 4 lab tests, each one at 10% would mean that lab is a total of 40% of the course grade. Okay? Okay, so anyway, other announcements and reminders. Okay, next Friday, there is no class here at the college. It is a holiday. It is Good Friday, I believe, and therefore we will not have class next Friday. So therefore, when will we continue with the study of bones? That will be the Friday afterwards, at the beginning of April, on April 5th. Okay, so meaning that we have an extra week or an extra weekend to study and prepare for the bone practical. So that's what we'll be doing these next 3 labs. We'll be studying, preparing for the bone practical exam. Okay, so the next lab exam will be a bone practical exam. And there will be questions set up on stations, such as, for instance, like you see on my table here, there may be a foot, there may be some bones, but you will go around, circulate around the room, and go to each different station. Well, there'll be some questions, 2 questions at each station, and you'll be asked about the items on the station. For instance, they may have a sticker here, say, what bone is this? And they may have another sticker here, say, what bone is that? Okay, so those are the style of questions that you'll have on the bone practical. You'll be given a minute, the first round for every station. When the buzzer or the bell goes off, you must move on to the next station, and so forth and so forth. So altogether, there'll be 25 stations with 2 questions at each station. Therefore, that will be a total of how many questions? 25 stations, 2 questions each station, so therefore a total of 50 questions. Good. Then I will duplicate the score so that you know your score in the percentage form. So if you got 50 out of 50, that is equal to 100%. If you got 30 out of 50, that's a passing score. That would equal to 60%. And so on. Anyway, you will get a minute the first time around each station. And then when you finish all the stations, you will end up where you started. Let's say you started here, and you will be given an extra 30 seconds more to review your answers or add anything that you missed. So really, you're getting a minute and a half for every station with 2 questions. But divided into 2 rounds. The first round, a whole minute for every station. The second round, 30 seconds extra for every station. Okay? That's what the practicals are like. So bone practical and the muscle practical will be similar style. Now, on the bone practical, it'll be a little bit more complex. That is because we have a variety of questions. We have not just naming the bones, like for instance, name this bone, name this bone, name that bone, name this bone. But they also have questions like, for instance, name this part of the bone. Like for instance, this large part here on this bone, or this bone. That's called the head of the femur, for instance, or the head of the humerus. Or for instance, they might ask you to name this notch, or name this depression, or name this line that you see on the skull, for instance. That is called a suture, right? This is, by the way, the frontal or coronal suture. So that style of questions will make a greater variety of questions as well. Sato, are you recording? But not my face, right? Okay. All right. Then there'll be another type of questions as well. For instance, is this a right one or a left one? Very few like that. Very few. Maybe a couple of questions like that where it asks you, is this a right one or a left one? With the bones of the limbs mainly, meaning the arms, legs, hips, and shoulder. Okay. So there could be questions where it asks you to name, is this right one and left one? And then there'll be questions with this model. A couple of questions with this model. This is the model that shows us the 2 different types of bone tissue. Bone tissue. So this is for studying bone tissues. Although it's just 2 questions, okay, just 2 questions, still you want to review it if you're aiming for a perfect score, right? 2 questions, or perhaps 2 questions may make you reach that passing score or the score that you're aiming for, maybe a B or a C, whatever you're aiming for. So it is important that you try to study as much as you can. But 90% of the questions, 90% of your questions will be questions that you see on the bone list. Okay, let me see if I have any additional copies here. I have my own copy here, but there's a bone list, okay? And I do have a few extra copies if someone did not, bring their bone list or forgot their bone list. That's okay. I have a few extra copies. You can always print another one out for yourself in the library for free or at home. And then, in addition, the study hall usually has these bone lists for free for students who really need them. So you can drop by. They run out sometimes, but if you stop by the study hall, you'll find that they sometimes have these bone lists and the muscle list there as well. Okay, the study hall doesn't open, I think, till 10, so they're closed right now, but later on you can check if you still need a bone list. But I do have several copies here for students who do need them today. Okay, I'll give that out later on as you study the bones. Okay, so what else? One other type of variety of questions that they often ask, besides parts of the bones, like what is this part called? What is this part called? What is this part called? What is this depression called? Or, this bump, or, whatever. This, they will also ask you to name the bones, and also they can ask you several questions about articulations. What is an articulation? What does articulation mean? Joint, exactly. How bones join together. So for instance, they could ask you about this bone, not just the name of the bone, but the second question could say, what does it articulate with distally, meaning at this end? Proximally, the upper end, distally, the farther end away. Okay? So distally articulates with these two bones, the two bones that you have in your forearm, the ulna and the radius. Or here's another example question. For instance, they could ask you, like this bone here. This is called, anybody know what this bone is called? The clavicle, right? It's your collarbone. Now, by the way, you do have to name these bones by their proper anatomic name. You can't say the collarbone, the shoulder bone, the knee bone, the leg bone. That's something that you learned in kindergarten, right? The knee bone's connected to the leg bone. The leg bone's connected to the hip bone. And there was even a song about that. No, you have to know the proper name. So this is called clavicle. And the clavicle, for instance, has two sides, has one end here and one outer end here. A medial end and a lateral end. You have to become familiar with those terms as well. Next week we'll discuss those familiar terms like medial, lateral, proximal, distal, anterior, posterior, and so forth. Today we're going to just introduce bones. But as you can see, the medial end articulates, so they could take that bone, give it to you, ask you the name of that bone. Okay, that's the clavicle. And the second question could say, what does it articulate with medially? Medial would be here at this medial end. And medial articulates with this structure here, which is part of this bone here. The bone is called the sternum. So that structure right there in the middle, looks like the bow of a tie. That's called the manubrium. So there's a type of question where they can ask about joints. Or any other joints. Usually joint questions will be questions of joints with either your shoulders and your arms, your hips and your legs. Okay? Most of the axial bones, the bones in the middle of your body, like your skull and your rib cage and so forth, your spine, are questions that they will not usually use for joints, for articulations, unless they can ask for the neck, for instance, in the neck, how those two bones in the spine articulate together, or what they articulate with. So articulations is a popular type of question on the bone practical, meaning joints, how bones join together. It's not that difficult. If you learn the position or the place where the bone is, just have a general idea where the bone is, then you could probably figure out what bone it will join with, right? For instance, let's take an example. An easy one, maybe an easy one that you could probably determine where it is, okay? So let's say, for instance, the tibia. Anybody know where the tibia is located?
In the legs.
In the legs, right. This is the tibia right down here. The tibia, if you ever get kicked there, it really hurts bad because there's really no muscles on this fine edge of the tibia. There's no muscle there. And you've all felt that pain when you got kicked or hit right there. It really hurts bad because there's no muscle there. Anyway, the tibia. So now you know where the tibia is. So now that you know on the tibia, right, with pictures of the skeleton, now you can tell me what does it articulate with distally, meaning down at the bottom end. And distally articulates, you have an idea now, it's going to articulate with this, right, with this thing. Looks like a saddle. In fact, that's where it'll fit nicely so that it can turn. And your leg goes, your ankle does this. Anyway, now that you know that, where it is, a general idea where it is, now you have to learn the name of that bone. And that's the calcaneus. So really learning the names of the bones first and having a general idea where it is on your body, you can determine afterwards what and how it articulates. Okay? Okay, you'll learn that in the next 3 weeks. In fact, you have an extra Friday off. So next Friday, you want to... by the way, I don't know if the college will be open next Friday or the study hall. It doesn't say college closed, it just says no classes. So I'm not sure. You might want to check with the library and the study hall. Will they be open next Friday? Okay. It doesn't say college closed, it just says no classes. And usually when it says no classes, the college is still open. You know, the gym is still open, the library. But you might want to double check before you plan to come in next Friday, just in case. Because if the college is closed, then unfortunately there's nothing really you can do about it. Okay. So those are some things that we'll be doing this week, and I don't really have more copies of this, but this is just a quick review sheet of what to review for the bone practical. I did post it. It is in your documents there in the first lab, right? Lab number 4 for the study of bones, right? The documents there that you have, and it says a list or a quick list, review list of what to review for the bone practical. And again, review your bone list. Review this really well. This is 90% of your exam. This is most of your exam. The bone list. Learning these parts and these bones perfectly well. The other smaller percent of questions will be, for instance, identify right versus left. Articulations, how bones join together with each other. For instance, the patella. How does that articulate? The patella articulates posteriorly, meaning to the back of it, posteriorly with this large bone called the femur. The patella is that, by the way, that little kneecap that you see there, but it's called the patella. What else? The vertebrae. Be able to distinguish the different vertebrae. I have here on my table for students to share. Okay, you can't keep it for yourself. So when you're done reviewing this, please put it back so that another student can use. Okay. But you also do have vertebrae in your boxes. In the boxes, the bone boxes that you see there, you'll be using that today. Each table will have one, or each side will have one, and then you'll have vertebrae as well. Review the different vertebrae. The atlas and axis are two special ones here. The atlas and the axis are two special ones because these are different from all of the other cervical vertebrae. They are cervical vertebrae, but they seem to be a lot different in structure and in shape than most of the other cervical vertebrae. This is a normal cervical vertebrae, maybe C3, C4, C5, C6, or C7. Okay? But the first two cervical vertebrae are specifically called atlas and axis. You see the axis has that little thing that looks like a thumb pointing up? That's called the axis. These two join together, so that allows you to do this when you turn your neck. Okay? So these two vertebrae are a little bit different than the other cervical vertebrae, so you do have to know these separately and individually. But you do have here, for instance, and in your boxes, regular cervical vertebrae. You do have thoracic vertebrae, and here at the bottom you see some lumbar vertebrae. So review the different types of vertebrae today as well. Or on the following lab, when we come back. The next lab that we'll have will be April 5th. Okay, so next week there's no Friday class. What else to review? The different ribs. You have a rib cage here. You have in total 22 ribs, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way down to 12. 12 ribs on each side. Therefore, you'd have 24 ribs. Okay. Okay. So now, what else? The sinuses. Now, for sinuses, we have here in this box the paranasal sinuses. Sinuses are these cavities, these large cavities that we have in the middle of our face, within our bones. Sometimes they get swollen. Sometimes you feel that it hurts because of congestion, or maybe because it's very cold, and some people who suffer from something called sinusitis. Right? If you do suffer from sinusitis, it means that you have inflammation and a lot of mucus production within the sinuses there. Right? They have all different things to clear out your sinuses. However, for sinuses, you have to take a skull, like this one here, or in these two boxes, and you have to split it like this. Separate it carefully. You don't want to damage any of these items. Oh, I see. The jaw stuck there. Okay, and you can take one half off, and by having half of this, you can now look at those cavities here. Like this one's called the sphenoid sinus. You have one here in your cheek. Refer to the bone that covers your cheek. That's called the maxillary sinus. A frontal sinus right here. That large cavity right there, the frontal sinus, which is right behind the frontal bone. And then you have a smaller one there. There are 4 main sinuses that you can review with pictures and then compare it with the plastic model. I may have another extra one here. I think so. No, not quite. Oh, here, yeah, we do. This is the upper left half. So it'll be the upper left half of face, and you can see there the sinuses as well. So yes, please, if you're using these, be careful, and also when you're done, please put it back so another student can use. Don't hold on to it for the whole class. Other students want to look at it as well. What else did you review? This little thing, mainly for the skull, to review the fontanelles of the skull of a fetus. Fetuses and babies, when they're just born, they have these spaces. If you ever felt the baby's soft spot there, you shouldn't put your finger too strong in it, but very gently. There's a soft spot there. That's because the bones didn't fuse yet completely. So what you have there are spaces there called fontanelles. You have, for instance, here a frontal fontanelle, another one in the back, and 2 more on the side. Review those fontanelles with diagrams and then with this model. Again, we only have one of these models. And also be careful with this one, because I noticed that when you pick this up, see how that comes off? It doesn't, the glue, I guess, wore out. So be careful when you carry this, not just one hand, it can fall and break. So use 2 hands with this one. Do you have to learn the names of the bones with this fetal skeleton? No, not really, but they sometimes do ask the larger bones. Like, for instance, name this bone here. That's the humerus. Or name this bone, the femur. Or name this bone, right? That's the hip bone that we call the coxal bone. It's called the coxal bone. Okay? Or they could ask about these bones, right? The parietal bone, the frontal bone, etc. So they do sometimes use that for names of bones as well, besides the fontanelles, for names of the big bones that you can see. But for bigger bones, what they will use maybe will be mostly the large bones that you have in your boxes. So those are a few things to review that make up a smaller percent of the questions. And for feet and hands, you have also some bones that are very similar, like these bones in your feet and hands. They're called phalanges, and these here are called metatarsals, and in your hands, right here, they're called metacarpals. Then you have wrist bones. The wrist bones are called carpals. You have 8 different wrist bones. You do have to learn each wrist bone. And also you have 7 different bones here in this part of your foot. Each one has a name. Like this is the calcaneus, this is the talus, and so on and so on. Okay, so with the hand and foot, by the way, they will give you a whole foot or a whole hand on the exam. They won't just give you one little bone like this. That's impossible. That's impossible to know exactly what bone that is. Is that from the hand or the foot or from some other place? Too difficult. So for the tiny bones here, the small bones in your hands and feet, they will give you the whole foot and the whole hand. For the other bones, they can give you separate. A femur, a humerus, a tibia, a radius, they can give you those bones separate. A hip bone, a shoulder bone, whatever, they give you those bones separate. But for the hand and feet, the good thing is they give you the whole foot like that, and could ask 2 questions about it, and or something about articulation as well. So for instance, this bone here is called the talus. It articulates superiorly, means above. Superiorly articulates with what? The talus articulates superiorly with what bone? We said it a moment ago. Tibia. Tibia, right, the tibia, which is this bone in your leg, right? The tibia. That's why it turns like this. Like, actually, I think this came from here. If I pick this up, see, it goes this. Actually, this is the wrong side, by the way. This is the right foot. But just to have an idea how it fits in that saddle to do this. Okay. And one last type of question, which is rare, but they sometimes do have it, is, for instance, compare the 2 types of hips, male from female. And we have the 2 different types of hips over there, male, female. That we'll go over next week, how to compare which is male and female. But if you like, you could look at those today, start looking at those. So those different types of questions could be other variety of questions that are lesser in number. Most of the question will be your bone list. But if you look at a perfect score, you want to learn many of those other things that they're supposed to. Okay? Any questions up to here? Questions so far? Okay, we still have a long time before the bone practical. The bone practical exam is scheduled for April 19th. April 19th. Oh, almost a month away. You have almost a month away for the bone practical exam. Again, April 19th, Friday, April 19th, is the date of our bone practical. Okay? And I'll brief you some more as we get closer to that date. Okay, any questions? Questions up to here? By the way, attendance I already took as you were taking your exams. I took attendance, everyone was present. Okay, so I already marked you down for attendance. Okay, now, let us therefore introduce the study of the skeletal system and begin our study of the bones. Any questions up to here? No questions? Okay, so let's continue. So, first of all, I'd like to start by asking you, how many bones does the human skeleton have? The human skeletal system has, in total, how many bones? Anyone like to take a guess? 200? Okay, anybody else? Anybody a bit higher? 206? Anybody a bit higher or lower? 206 is correct. Good. So the human skeleton has 206 bones. Those of you who said 206 are correct. Okay, good. That now makes you a little bit nervous, that you have to learn 206 different bones. The good news is, though, that 6 bones, we're not going to discuss. 6 tiny bones, which are in your middle ear, will be learned in SCB 204. 6 bones. Okay? 6 bones are in the tiny ear, 3 in each side of your ear, in the middle ear. They're called the ossicles. We won't learn those. You learn about the ossicles when you learn about the sense of hearing and the ear in SCB 204. So it still sounds like a lot of bones you still have to learn. 200 bones you still have to learn. Well, here's some more good news. A lot of the bones you'll see either come in double or in multiples. Like for instance, you have 12 different thoracic vertebrae. 12 thoracic vertebrae, meaning that you don't have to learn every single individual thoracic vertebrae. You can just learn one, and all the others will have the same features. Lumbar vertebrae. You have several lumbar vertebrae. Learning just one to see what it looks like, okay, is sufficient, that you don't really have to learn every single individual lumbar vertebrae. So as you can see, there are many bones that come in multiples. Another example of bones that come in multiples are, for instance, the ribs. All of these are true ribs, and they look very similar. They're actually the same, really, except in size. Another group of bones that look similar are the bones that we have here in our fingers, but they do come in many. The phalanges. Now, for phalanges, you want to, just in case, review, though. You want to, just in case, review that we do have 3 different types of phalanges. The ones that hold your nails, those are called distal. The ones in the middle are called middle phalanges, and the ones that are closest to your knuckles, right here, if I bend this like knuckles, these right here closest to your knuckles, those are called the proximal phalanges. So you have proximal, middle, and distal. Distal are the ones that are closest to your nail. When you look at your own hands, these are your phalanges, the ones that do this with your fingers. So you have 1, 2, 3. The only one that has 2 phalanges is your thumb. See how your thumb doesn't bend the same way like your index finger? Your thumb bends only this way? That's because the thumb only has 2 phalanges. A distal, again, the distal phalanges are the ones with your nail. The proximal phalange is the one that's closest to the knuckle. Proximal, distal. The thumb and the big toe also only has 2 phalanges, as you can see right here. 1, 2, okay? Proximal, distal. Again, distals are the ones that have your nails. While your other toes have 3 phalanges, right? Proximal, middle, and distal. Proximal, middle, distal. Proximal, middle, distal. Proximal, middle, distal. These are, all of them are phalanges, but in case they sometimes have asked in the past to be specific what type of phalange is that, then that will be proximal, that will be distal, okay? And in these, you would have 3 different ones. Are these phalanges? Anybody remember? We mentioned it maybe 5 minutes ago. Metatarsals. Those are metatarsals, yes. And the rest in your ankle, these are tarsal bones. Okay, so you're going to be learning that today and next week and the following weeks. Okay, so as you can see, our list of 200 bones that you have to learn reduced by a lot more, because many bones come in multiples, many bones come in doubles. For instance, 2 humerus, one on the right, one on the left. 2 femurs, one on the left, one on the right. 2 tibias, 2 fibulas, 2 radiuses, and 2 ulna. So a lot of bones come in doubles or in multiples, like your spine, your ribs, and so forth. Okay. So again, if you thought, wow, 200 is a lot to learn, it really reduces it by a lot more. In addition, you have 4 weeks to study the bones still. There's plenty of time. And students who've taken this course in the 6-week session had learned the bones in 2 weeks. So you guys are getting 4 weeks, that's a lot of time. So start now, start studying the bones. And already, I've seen students already studying bones even before, from the beginning of the semester, because they know that bone practical is important and tough. Okay, so we'll really be learning about 2 different type of bones, but again, many of them come in multiples. So what we want to talk about now is, what about bone tissue? Since this model will be used on the exam for 2 questions. This model is a representation of bone tissue. Okay, let me put this fellow down or to one side so that I could use the table there. Okay, so let's look at this model. And you do have some PowerPoints and pictures there of something that discusses compact bone or bone tissue, something that looks like this. So if I turn it around, you can see here one of the types of bone tissue called compact bone. The other type of bone tissue is right here, called spongy bone. Now, by the way, this is thousands of times greater magnification of a piece of bone tissue. So when they take bone tissue, right, they slice a piece off, put it on a microscope slide, right, you will be seeing something that looks like this, magnified 1,000 times or more than that bigger. So there's no bone this big in the human. Not even a whale has a bone this big. Okay? And a whale is the largest mammal on Earth. Okay? So yeah, there's no bone this big, but it's a magnification of bone tissue made hundreds and thousands of times larger to see specific things. So let's review this for a moment. Let's review our bone tissues. Some instructors call it bone types, 2 bone types. Okay? Okay, or bone tissues, I prefer to say bone tissue, because this way you will understand that it's a type of tissue that's in your bones. Right? It's called bone tissue. Now, we have 2 main types of bone tissue. Okay? 2 main types of bone tissue. The first one that we'll look at is the one that has most things. Okay? And that's this part here that you see in yellow, with some areas that look gray. Okay? So what we call this type of bone tissue, we mentioned it twice already, like a minute ago. What type of bone is this? Compact bone. Good, compact. Why is it called compact? It's called compact because it gives strength to your bones, right? It's that thick layer, right? So, compact bone. Okay, so compact. Let's go over compact bone because it's what has the most things. Okay. Now again, this model is always on the exam. I can guarantee this is going to be on the exam, and it will probably have just 2 questions on this model. So although 2 questions doesn't seem like a lot, why spend so much time with this? 2 questions can make a big difference between a C and a C plus, or between a certain score and the next score, like an A minus to an A. So, or a perfect score. But still, I can guarantee this will be on the exam with 2 questions only. So let's go over this. Now, what we see here with compact bone, here with this whole part here, you can appreciate that it looks solid. That's what it kind of is like in your body, in your bones. It's solid and tough. That gives the toughness to your bones, right? The toughness to your bones, right? Anyway, When we look at compact bone, let's look at compact bone first, number one. Compact bone. Like any structure, like a wall, like any other tissue, there has to be some type of basic unit or some type of structural unit, like bricks on a wall or beams on a building. So what is the structural units of compact bone called? They're called the osteons. Osteons. So here, do we have osteons? Yes. Let's look at the model here for a moment. And you see these circular things that look like targets? This circular thing that's pulled out. Some of them are pulled out, and some of them have just been cut, sliced, like this. These round circular things that look like rings or look like targets, you see, that practically make up your compact bone, are called the osteons. So osteons are the structural units of compact bone. As you can see on my model, a couple of osteons have been pulled out to show some interesting things. But you do see a lot of other osteons on the model as well. Okay, so let me draw a few osteons here. This is one osteon. And as you can see, every osteon looks kind of like a target because it has rings. Let me draw another osteon. And one more. Okay, so I drew a few osteons there. So that whole structure that you see there is called an osteon. So you have 3 examples of osteons. Now, you don't have to draw that. You have some nice pictures in your books. However, as you can see, just some simple shapes can help clarify these things. Now, look at every osteon, and it has several parts. If we look at every osteon here, let me put this, I don't know if that works. Put it sideways. If you look at every osteon, it has parts. So one part of the osteon, by the way, is this central hole in the middle. That hole that's in the middle of every osteon. That large hole in the middle of every osteon is called the central canal. This is called the central canal. Central canal. Okay, so every osteon has a central canal. As you can see on my model, every osteon has a big hole in the center of it. Now, what's in that canal? There are blood vessels in the canal. If I turn this around from a side view, like this, you can see here the central canals. You see these vertical tubes? Here you see several examples of central canals as well, from a sagittal view, from a lateral view, okay? But going through these central canals are actually, if I turn it around to the other side, are actually blood vessels going through them like this. Blood vessels. Okay? Blood vessels are important so that they can distribute nutrients into the bone tissue. Anyway, this would be central canal, central canal, central canal. The vertical ones that you see here that match up to these large holes, would be central canals. So you can see them from 2 different views, from above or from the side on either side. Okay, so now, let's move on to, though, another part here of the osteon. So let's look at some other parts of the osteon. The rings that you see around the central canal. Those rings that you see here. The rings that you see that are around the central canal are called concentric lamella. Concentric means to go around something. Concentric lamella. Lamella. Lamella means like a ring, like a layer. Concentric lamella. So you can see that, for instance, this osteon has several concentric lamella. 1, 2, 3, 4. Some of them may have more than that. Like on the model here, you can see that, for instance, this one here has several layers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Or these. This one has more than 6 concentric lamella. or this one, or even this one. You can see that it has more than half a dozen concentric lamella. So the concentric lamella are these rings, which you can see either nicely here or with any of the other target-shaped structures. Okay? Okay, so those are a couple of parts important here that you find in every osteon. It has central canal with rings around it. Like, you ever cut an onion in half? You cut the onion in half. When you cut it in half, the rings around the center are kind of like the concentric lamella. Okay, what else do we have here in the osteons? Okay, in between these lamella, in between these concentric lamella, there will be gaps or spaces like this. I'm going to draw just a few, not to waste too much time. Okay, so you see kind of like little gaps, little tiny spaces there in between the concentric lamella. On the model here, on the model, the tiny gaps that you see there are those little like pits. It almost seems like somebody took a knife and did this. Okay, those little tiny pits that you see there, like little tiny holes, squeezed in between the lamella, all over, are called lacuna. Where did you see the word lacuna before? In cartilage. Cartilage has spaces, right, called lacuna. In bone, in compact bone, there's also lacuna. However, the lacuna located here. Those little tiny holes that you see as though somebody took a knife and did this. Okay? Those tiny little holes are like pits, like little tiny crevices or spaces, which are called lacuna. So let me point at this one here. That's a lacuna. And what's important about these lacuna, like in cartilage, what was in the lacuna? A cell, right? A cell lived in the lacuna. Same thing here. In these lacuna, there's a cell. The cell that's in the lacuna, I'm going to draw with a red marker. With a red marker. And the cell that's in the lacuna, like this, is called an osteocyte. Let me draw another one. A cell in the lacuna, we call the osteocyte. These are the important cells that deposit minerals into your bone, the osteocytes. So every one of these lacuna are going to have an osteocyte in it. Now, the interesting thing about osteocytes is that osteocytes have like little arms and legs like this. Look like spiders. Like this. Those little arms and legs that osteocytes have, right? They actually spread like this. That if you continue to look at the compact bone, you'll see that there's lots of little like lines like this, like eyelashes. Those little lines that you see there, can you see them here? From where you are, perhaps not. But when you look at this model later on, you could look at it closely. You see, yeah, I do see those little lines. You may not be able to see right now, but there's little tiny lines. Okay, you'll get a chance to see it. Those lines are called canaliculi. Canaliculi. The word canaliculi means tiny canals. Canaliculi means tiny canals. So these osteocytes form little tiny canals that spread into the rings, right? The rings that we call lamella. Okay, so these are some of the important things here with the osteons. Okay. Now, what I want to go over though is a few more things about compact bone. A few more things about compact bone. So osteons, but now let's continue with the compact bone. Okay. Now, we do have one other type of canal with a different name. Now remember, these are your central canals. Central canal. And if you look at it from a lateral view, this would be a central canal, central canal, central canal, central. The vertical ones that go down like this, those are central canals. But you do see a different type of canal here that's more diagonal or horizontal. See, like this one. Horizontal or diagonal. That's not a central canal. those connect the central canals, right? See the central canal here and this one here? It's connected by a different canal here that's more horizontal, like these, or diagonal, like these. Those are called Volkmann or perforating canals. So you wouldn't see it from this view. You don't see it like this. You have to turn it around like this. Same thing on the other side. You don't see it like this, but by turning this around lateral view, you can see there some of these perforating, they're called perforating canals. So we'll add that here to our list of compact bone. Perforating canal. We can put it up here. So a few other things here about compact bone. The perforating canals. The perforating canals, by the way, are also called Volkmann's canals. Volkmann, named after a professor who discovered these. Volkmann, Professor Volkmann. Volkmann's canals. But anyway, perforating canal is perfectly fine. If you can't remember or don't remember how to spell the word Volkmann, just put perforating canals. Okay, another interesting thing that we have here in compact bone, and it is important that you learn the bone tissue, the histology of bone, because we'll discuss that in lecture at some point as well. Anyway, let's go back to the bone tissue here, and let's look at what else do we have here. Here, oh, by the way, I forgot to show you the osteocytes. The osteocytes are these little dark brown cells that you see here that look like spiders. These little dark brown, see those little dark brown cells? Those are examples of osteocytes. They kind of look like spiders because of the legs that they have, the arms and legs that they have. But here's some good examples. Dark brown cells, dark brown cells. So how would you know if they're asking you about the cell or about the space? That's how they would ask you. What is the name of the space? Lacuna. What is the name of the cell? Osteocyte. Okay, but now going to some other things here with compact bone. We did already look at one of the types of layers called concentric lamella. Concentric lamella. But you have two other types of lamella as well, two additional types of lamella. One of the other types of lamella is one that fills in the gaps here. Fills in the gaps. See the gap there? That's because osteoids are circular. Osteoids are circular. Because osteoids are round or circular, it leaves lots of gaps or spaces in between them. Like this gap here. If osteoids were square, there'd be no gap. It'd be like your tiles, nicely all, locked in together. But because they're round, that's why they don't make round tiles. If they do make round tiles, then they have to put a lot of cement in between the gaps there. But here in bone, right, in bone, those gaps in between the osteoids are called interstitial lamella. Interstitial lamella. Interstitial means in between, right? The word interstitial means in between. So lamella in between the osteoids. Interstitial lamella. By the way, I don't make a big deal about double letters or single letters. Lamella is spelled with two L's at the end. But if you put one L, that's fine. It sounds the same. Okay, I usually go by the way the word sounds. So if you spell it like it sounds, I'll give you usually credit. You do have to practice your spelling, by the way. Do practice your spelling. Okay. So the interstitial lamella. Can I show you an example? Yes, let me come around for these first two tables. And here you see some pieces of lamella in between the osteoids. Here's another example. And you see many more, like here, here. So small pieces of lamella that fit in between the gaps there. Here's a good example. Here's one that somebody highlighted with a red marker. Here's another one. And let me come down to these last two tables. This is one, here's another, here's another. And you could probably identify many more, like this one here, etc. So those small pieces of tissue that fill in those gaps are called interstitial lamella. But we have one third type of lamella. This big one out here. this large, broad one, wide, large one here. See these pieces look like crackers? This third type of lamella is the one that is near the surface of the bone, around the surface. Here, not here, but here on the outer surface. And there on the outer surface, you see those long pieces of lamella. If I drew it, it would kind of look like this. Okay? That lamella that you have there near the surface, outer surface, and even you do have some on the inner surface as well. Here, but most of it's out here. That's called circumferential lamella. Circumferential, let me make some room here. Circumference lamella. Oh, I spelled circumferential wrong. There we go. Circumferential lamella. So circumference means around something, right? Like the outer edge of some big thing. Circumference, right? So circumferential lamella is the one that you see that on the model will be these examples, or this here. So 3 types of lamella here. Okay, 2 more things here with compact bone. So let's look at the outer surface. This is the outer surface. What we're looking at here is a tiny piece of bone taken. So if I took a knife like this and cut right here, a small thin piece, pulled it out and put it under a microscope, the outer surface has some tissue here. On the outer surface, not on this bone, but on real bones when live bones are taken out from a person's body, here on the outer surface, you have this connective tissue here. This connective tissue thing that you see here in gray, that's called the periosteum. So how can I draw periosteum? I need some room here. Let me erase that word compact bone so I have a little bit of space there. Again, we're still discussing compact bone. So let's put out a title here, compact bone. And here around the circumference, or around the circumferential lamella, we have a thin, on the model it's in gray, this right here, okay, a thin connective tissue membrane, like this, a thin connective tissue membrane that if I try to peel it off, if I try to take it off, it's very tightly attached to the surface of your bone, tightly attached through these fibers. The fibers that you see here are called perforating or Sharpie's fibers. So let's put the name of both things. The periosteum, that's the very thin connective tissue membrane that if you ever eat bone, like chicken bone or something, when you finish with all the meat, on the surface is a very fine, thin, transparent membrane, very thin, transparent membrane that with a butter knife, you can try to peel it off a little. Next time you do that, eat bones, try to peel it off with a butter knife. And it's tightly attached to the surface through those fibers that you see there. The fibers are called perforated fibers or Sharpie's fibers. Perforated, also called Sharpie's fibers, after the name, like the Sharpie's markers. But I don't think it's the same person who invented this. Sharpie's fibers. Okay, so let's look at these 2 things with the model here. This gray membrane that you see there, that's the periosteum. The fibers that you see there in white little like lines, white lines, those are the perforated or Sharpie's fibers. Okay, and that covers that model. Any questions about any of these things? The Volkmann canals? This very sophisticated canal system, like subway system, why do we have such a complex subway or a complex canal system? So that we can distribute blood and nutrients to every part of your bone tissue. The perforating canals or the Volkmann canals can communicate. See, they communicate in between your central canals. So that blood can go this way as well, not just up and down. Okay. The cells. we call osteocytes, and so on. Up to there, any questions? Okay, and you have some great diagrams to review as well. Let me put this over here so that anyone who wants to study that can look at that later on. Okay? Do review that. Don't waste too much time, but review it. Give yourself maybe at least 10, 15 minutes to review that Learn the Parts one. But review it, because two questions can make a big difference in your score. Huh?
The boneless, can we have that now?
Well, soon, when you start studying the bones.
Oh.
Okay. All right, now, the other important thing that we're going to learn now in the morning, this morning, or well, yeah, it's still morning, is this type of bone. Now, as you can see, we have different shapes of bones. The shapes of bones, they put some different shapes in bones, okay, come in different sizes and shapes, right? Bones come in different sizes and shapes. For instance, a bone like this, like the ones that you have in your skull or your scapula, are mostly flat. So these are described as being a flat-shaped type of bone, flat bones. Okay, then you have bones like this one here. This is called a long bone. A long bone, right? Like most of the bones in your limbs, in your arms, and in your legs. You do also have long bones, for instance, in your feet and hands. Although they are smaller, these are also considered to be long bones. So long bone has a certain lengthy axis, a lengthy structure. Although it's, again, not as big as this one, these are still considered to be of that shape, long bones. Okay? Smaller, but they are long bones. Then you have bones that have more of a cuboidal shape, like this. Those are called short bones. Long bones, short bones. Okay? Most of your short bones are in your ankles, like these, or in your hands, in your wrist. Right here, in your wrist. You have a lot of these different types of short bones, like the scaphoid, the pisiform, the capitate, and so forth. Anyway, you'll be learning those bones. So short bones have more of a cuboidal shape, like this. Okay? And then lastly, any bone that does not fit those regular shapes, it's not flat, it's not long or short, but has a shape like this, we say it would just be an irregular shape. Irregular. Like your vertebra. Your vertebrae is irregular. Your mandible, that's your jaw. Your jaw, right? Your mandible is an irregular bone. Okay? And there are many other irregular shapes. Of all the different shapes of bones, the one that you want to learn is the anatomy of a long bone. Whether it's a big one like the femur or smaller like the phalanges. But all long bones will have some common things. Let me get some space there. The anatomy of a long bone. And will that long bone be used on an exam? It could be. It often is. It often is. So there's a good chance this is going to be on the exam, something like this, to show you the anatomy of a long bone. How many questions? Probably just 2 questions also. But again, if you're aiming for a perfect score, you want to review that quickly. So let's review the anatomy of a long bone. Now, from looking at the back of this, I know that this is the femur. Because I can see it has these 2 knob-like structures here. It has a large bump here. So I know that this is the femur. Where's the other half of the femur? The other half is probably being used by the other class. There's 2 or 3 classes, I think, at the same time. Anyway, each class gets 1/2, so we got 1/2 here. And what we see there is that we can see a large bone, or long bone, like the femur or any other long bone, that if you cut it like this, you can actually review the anatomy, the general anatomy of a long bone. So one thing that the anatomy of a long bone has, let's take a picture here. I'm going to draw something. It doesn't matter what bone this is, but it's a long bone. It could even be a phalange. Shorter or smaller, but it still is a long bone, right? So what long bone is that? I don't know. Looks kind of like the femur. Could be a phalange, could be the humerus, whatever. But anyway, what you see right here is that the long part of the long bone, the shaft of the long bone, is called the diaphysis. 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 So here, on my bone, by the way, this is a real bone. This is a real bone that's been cut in half. Okay. On the exam and in the class, you'll see many of the bones are real. That's plastic. A lot of those things in your boxes are plastic, but some of the boxes, like this one, has real bones. This has real. This has real. This is fat. This is plastic. It doesn't matter. This is real, by the way, and you shouldn't have to worry because it's been cleaned well. It's been put in lye that burns off all, any flesh and meat and any tissues left. Just leaves the bone. So the diaphysis is this part here. This part here, where cavemen hold, right? They hold it here to hit somebody. No? Where people will put this and tie a ribbon around it to put on their hair. Whatever it is, that long part here of the long bone is called the diaphysis. Now, what about the ends? This end and this end. The ends are called epiphysis. Epiphysis. The other epiphysis at the other end. The epiphysis. So every long bone's got to have one diaphysis, and it has to have two epiphyses at each end. Okay? So let's start with that. The diaphysis right here, the long part, and the epiphysis are the knob-like structures at each end, here and here. Now, after we slice the long bone like this, we slice it, we can see that inside there's a cavity, a long cavity within the diaphysis. That elongated cavity that's in the middle of the diaphysis like this, a space or a cavity within the diaphysis is called, right? It's called either the medullary cavity or the marrow cavity. Medullary, also called marrow cavity. Okay? The interesting thing is this, again, this is the marrow cavity here on this bone. This space, that long space that you see here. If I put your finger in it, it feels a little bit rough. It feels a little rough because of what's in there, right? But what's contained in this cavity, what's contained in the cavity is something called bone marrow. If it were a child's bone, a very young child, an infant or a very young child, 1, 2-year-old child, it would have their red bone marrow. But in adults, we have something else there that looks more fatty-like. And because of that, we call it yellow bone marrow. So in adults, it contains yellow bone marrow. At some point in your life, the red bone marrow converts into yellow bone marrow. So here, this is an adult bone, so therefore I would expect, and the question could ask, name this space, the medullary cavity. What's in this space? Question 2, what's in the space? In an adult, yellow bone marrow. Now I heard people, they like to eat the marrow. You can actually break the bone, and you suck it out, and it's kind of greasy. Kind of greasy, dark brown, yellowish color. That's because it contains a lot of fat, lipids. That's what gives it that yellowish color in adults. Okay? So because this is an adult bone, it would have yellow marrow here, yellow bone marrow. But what about the red bone marrow? The red bone marrow, that will be contained up here. Up here. So let me draw what we have here. I'm just going to draw quickly some little tiny circles there to give it sort of that spongy-like appearance. Same thing at the other end. looks spongy-like. So what we find there at the top and bottom, mostly here, and down here, is we find spaces that give it that spongy-like appearance. This is what we call spongy bone. So let's go back to my model again. My large model. Oops. Shouldn't put it this far away. But here, the other type of bone tissue. Number 2, right? We said compact bone was number 1. And number 2, the spongy bone type of tissue. Here on this model, this would be spongy bone. See this? Looks like a sponge. With spaces and very thin bony framework. The thin bony framework of spongy bone, that thin bony framework that you see there, looks like it's going to break and crack very easily. See that thin bony framework? It's called trabecula. Trabecula. It's spongy bone. Trabecula. Trabeculae means plural, trabecula means singular. It doesn't matter. I won't really be that specific. I mean, you could just put trabecula with A or without the E. You know? Anyway, the fine bony framework is called trabecula, and the spaces really have no name. But what's important is what's in those spaces. And what's in the spaces, what's in these spaces, what's in those spaces is a more reddish type of substance. A reddish type of material, substance that we call red bone marrow. That's in the space within those small little holes. So in these tiny little spaces here, there's red bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is in the center there of the diaphysis, in this long cavity here. But red bone marrow would mostly be located here in the spongy bone. So here, in these spaces, you have a reddish substance called red bone marrow. Okay? So that, another type of question that could ask with this model, the spongy bone, the trabecula, which is the columns here, the sort of like columns, like a very thin framework, and then the spaces which contain red bone marrow. Okay? And that also covers the anatomy of a long bone. Okay? One last thing here for the anatomy of a long bone. Let me just leave it here. Is that here, around the epiphysis, around portion of the epiphysis, there'll be some type of cartilage. Let me draw that with a blue marker. So here, around the epiphysis, for instance here as well, around the epiphysis, you'll have a thin layer there of some type of cartilage. What type of cartilage is it made of? Hyaline cartilage. So therefore, because it's here at the epiphysis, where it's going to form a joint with another bone, we will call that the articular cartilage, which is made of hyaline cartilage. The articular cartilage. Articular cartilage, which if you remember from your study of tissues, is made of hyaline cartilage. Do I have any models here that have articular cartilage? On your tables. On your tables. Let me see if I have an example here. No, not quite. I guess it would just be this shiny area here. Let me just push this down for a moment. You see the bone tissue, and then you see here something shiny. That, I guess, would be the best representation of articular cartilage. Okay? Anyway, in your textbooks, in your lab manuals, the articular cartilage is often drawn or colored like light blue color, because it kind of looks like a clearish light color, and to make it stand out, they usually use blue, light blue color. Doesn't matter though. As you can see, when you finish all the meat from a chicken bone, at the ends of the knobs, there's something that looks white and shiny. That's articular cartilage. So here, you have at the epiphysis articular cartilage to protect during movement of the joint. Okay, questions about the anatomy of a long bone. Questions about the anatomy of a long bone. Okay. On the surface here, on the surface, this is your compact bone, right? Your compact bone would be the area that is harder. So this would be compact bone. But on the surface of the compact bone here, this would be, if they ask you, name this type of tissue or bone tissue, that would be compact bone. Spongy bone is here. So you have a lot of compact bone. But what would cover the surface of your compact bone? What covers the surface? What do you have here on the surface of compact bone? That if you took a butter knife and tried to scrape it off, you might even be able to peel it off. But very tightly attached because it has spines. Periosteum. So there's no periosteum here, but this model shows you the periosteum on this side. Okay? Questions up to there? Any questions? Okay, guys, so let's see. If you need a break, you can take a 10-minute break and be back at 10:30, and then start studying the bones that you have in the boxes. Okay? You will have to use images, so you can use your devices today, your phones, whatever, to look at pictures that I posted there in your lab documents. If you have a lab manual or using some other source, that's fine as well, but you need some type of source so that you can review the different types of bones, okay? And then you can compare with the bones that you have in those wooden boxes. So while you're taking your break, we're going to move those boxes to the center of each side of the table so that you can start using them. If you need a break, take about 10 minutes. If you don't need a break, you want to already start studying the bones, you can start right away if you'd like. Okay? You do have to share those boxes, but I have one box at each side of the table.